Humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sivasankaran, Guru Piran Neo, fellow Nyanis. I'm going to continue with this topic on formless form by Mahan. This is the part 3 of our discussions. And I'm going to talk about some of the key, perspective that Swamiji has spoken about. Just to recap, what Swamiji spoke about is form. These are things that we can see, feel, touch, and this is our physical, things that we can, cognize and experience. Formless form is the experience of this form, in the form of hot, cold, sadness, happiness, joy, all those things. And formless is things such as, we have thoughts, ideas, conceptions. And it's quite interesting that, we see that Swamiji speaks about the seer is greater than the seen. And so you have the seeing process, and the seen. And we see that in this context, the objects we're able to see with our eyes, but we know that the objects are different from the eyes. Similarly, we see that the eyes is able to pick up, spectrums and brings it to the mind, and we know that there's a difference between the eyes and the mind. And similarly, we see that what is the importance of mind? Well, mind gives us the thinking process, generates thoughts, and beyond that mind, there is, something which Swamiji calls the seer, others calls it the consciousness, and so on. And there is a difference between the mind and that seer. And here we will start slowly defining what that seer is. So here we see that Swamiji says that the seer is greater than the seen. And he gives examples of that. So we saw in the last two satsangs some illustrations of this. And here there are further illustrations. Swamiji says that, from nothing, something by chance. That formless comes from nothing, nothing, neither matter nor energy, right? And from there emerged one thing, one primordial, and we spoke about this in some of the earlier satsangs. How did this nothing create this something, this primordial, the seed of our universe, which is four-dimensional. And from that one thing, many things, one thing becomes many things. And we see that, there is a process of birth, sustenance for a while, dissolution or destructions. And we see that, when destructions, at the destruction of many things, we see that other things emerge. So we see that, when we eat food, when we eat vegetables, we completely, dissolve it, and it takes on new forms as muscles and blood and cells and so on. And similarly, when we pass away, our body will disintegrate. If we bury the body, we see that the body will disintegrate and be absorbed, by, insects and, all those different microbes, and they will dissolve it. And you'll see that multiplicity of that emerges from that destruction of our body. So Swamiji says, this is the evolution of, this is the nature of our world, this material universe he's talking about. This, four-dimensional material universe, which has got three-dimensional space and time. Now, and he goes on to explain that, when something is, another example he gives is when the ground is clear of all the weeds, plants, all those things, you see that new things emerge. The buildings, emerge, and we see that many things within the building starts emerging. So what was a kind of a jungle, cleared, and then the development starts taking place, and new things starts emerging. But what is really interesting is all these new things also is the building block comes from nature itself. So it's nothing devoid of nature. It's just different forms of nature. In that same way, we see that while this everything comes from this one, and then it continuously transforms into different things. In that same way, we see that we all, when I mean we, it's not just the physical body, but I'm also talking about the spiritual consciousness emerge from one, and it gives multiplicity in terms of the experiences that we get. So in the form wise, we can see this very clearly, and I'm going to show you what happens in our mind and our spirit, how this is imprinted in all of us. So a classic example is, let me start with a blank sheet. So say this is formless, dimensionless, colorless. So, absence of this materiality and even time, you see, and we show through the, principles that Swamiji put forth, that from there, so this is, think of it as infinite potential and possibilities. It's beyond our own material universe of time and four-dimensional space, you see. So this is the nothing, substratum, or this irul, or the higher order continuum, whatever we call this, right? So we see that from there, we see that forces, that infinite potential collapse into our universe, into a primordial atom which had intensity. So from that formless, we started seeing form coming in the form of energy, matter, and so on. So this is the imprint that you're going to see across the entire universe, including in our mind, in our intellect, in our spiritual substratum. So this primordial atom gave rise to everything, and we saw this before, that including our own identity, our own personality. So in all this, we see that while we see form, within that form, that is formless. You see, so that's imprinted in everything that we do. So let's look at a little bit more in detail on this formless. So Swamiji here is defining this formless as this, dimensionless, colorless, substratum. So, and this formless also, we see that, will bring this down from the higher level to our own self. So we see that, our thoughts, our ideas are all formless because we cannot hold it. As I mentioned, the definition of form, formless form, and form. We see that form we can hold on with our hands, touch it. Formless form is we experience it, but we can't touch it. But formless is we get ideas, concepts, from things that we get it from, the substratum. Sometimes, of course, our thoughts and ideas come from our own experiences, but there are thoughts and experiences that we get, we call it inspiration or cosmic intelligence, and we channel that into our day-to-day life and create form and formless and all those things. So let's start with this formless. From this formless emerge. So this formless emerge form with formless. So let's start off with, if you see this concept of formless. What do I mean by formless? Think of a mind that is absolutely formless. What does that mean? It means a mind which is no thing. What does that mean? A mind that neither is caught in matter and energy. What does that mean? It means a mind that is absolutely quiet and silent, devoid of any thoughts. So this is the mind that we all actually are imprinted with. It is the mind that is imprinted with this formless, that happens when we are in deep sleep, in deep meditation, and also when we were before our birth of our body, and the first 2 to 3 years when we were in autopilot, or since conception, this is the formless that is embedded in all of us. Swamiji calls it Irul, others calls it, the spirit, consciousness, whatever we call it. But this is embedded in us. So if you don't understand this, do a thought experiment when you go to sleep tonight, when you have a deep sleep, wake up in the morning and ask, where were you? And you were actually in this state of formless. So we see that from that formless, when that absolute silence, you see that a thought emerge. And you watch the processes, how the thought emerges. The problem is that we always have these continuous thoughts that are coming, that we get caught up with all the thoughts. But observe how a thought is created in our mind. So actually, if you are in that deep silence, absolute silence, there is nothing but that formless. And that formless emerge a thought or an idea or a conception. It is also formless, but it has got the potential to become a formless form that gives you an inspiration, gives you a beautiful experience or sad experience that can translate into form. But the genesis is it starts from the formless. And this is so important later on when we navigate our life. So from this, we see that the thought that comes from that formless, right? And it gives you thoughts, inspiration, ideas that are also formless. How rich the experience is going to be, the formless form, depends on how lofty, how great, how inspirational that seed of that thought is, right? So we see that if that seed and the thought is beautiful, inspirational, universal, you see that if it is actioned, you see that the experience would be that. And even the formed things around you will also transform to that. But if that thought is something which is very negative or very destructive, you'll see that the experience will be very different. And what you translate that to the actions, you see that the outcomes will be very different. So the genesis is very important. That's why Swamiji says unarva gavanipa. Unarva means focus on that vibration and how you use that to generate your thoughts. So if that thought is universal, you see that your experience becomes universal. And we have seen great saints and sages that just plant that seed of universality and it reverberates, and the entire life becomes, the whole experience becomes universal, and their life becomes universal. They become transcendental. So we're bringing this concept of formless from the Irul, from all this, earlier discussion, now down to that imprint of that into our own DNA. And this is what Swamiji is doing in terms of how our mind is imprinted with this, great ideas and concepts, which actually are part of our DNA. So from that one thought, we see that if normally when we have a particular thought, right, and the thought will lead into other sub-thoughts. And eventually we start seeing we have a bunch of new thoughts that keeps emerging. Our mind becomes like a network. So we see that if we have a single universal thought, then the universal thought reverberates across our entire new thoughts that comes in, right? If you say, wow, I feel so inspirational, and that percolates into how I experience that day, my relationships, my interactions, and this is why it is so important that every morning this introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation enables you to create that universal optional thought that you have full control of. And initially it is very difficult, but this is where the meditational part is important, in giving you that silence. And in that silence, you're able to plant that, the primordial seed in you. And the primordial seed is very important. And we see that is why every morning, I try to put a message out, inspirational message that percolates in your mind, and how you experience that one thought that, then generates the entire spectrum of thoughts that reverberates. So we see this, the mind has that potential to reverberate with that universal thought. And you see that, your experiences now, what was formless, took on a formless thought. Now you're getting a formless form, which is an experience, an inspirational experience that now percolates into what you see. You feel inspirational. What you hear is inspirational. And what you do becomes inspirational. So we see this, happening. And this is really important. And we see that, that percolates into the facets of our lives. And we start seeing how this transforms our own lives. And as a child, when you are a child, how would your experiences be? And if you're exposed to this at a very early age, the child's experiences become very different from a child that is not exposed to this. So someone who's been, with that universal identity and a material identity, very different. Similarly, as we grow, as we develop, as our mind becomes more calmer and more universal, we see that while the body goes through its life cycle, the mind continuously grows. The mind continuously expands, including, as we grow older and as we face death, this death here, we are ready for death. Death is part and parcel of our life. And death is part and parcel of passing back our body to nature that has supported us maybe for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, to experience this limitedness. While experiencing this material limitedness, our mind was still unlimited, and we are ready to live to outlive it. So we see this, that formless gives you formless thoughts, and that formless thoughts, which either noble or lofty, gives you that experience of inspirational positivity, developmental, or on the other hand, destructive. And you see that it plays out in our lives, how our lives become, we push on, we contribute to knowledge, we become inspirational for others, or we become difficult and challenging for others. In all the circumstances, we all have to pass back our body back to nature. But in that process, while living, we live, the choices that we make depends very much on what we cultivate in our mind. So this understanding of this formless universal gives you that idea that, hey, I can plant any seed I want, and that seed determines what the experience and that, what the outcomes would be. So this is where we see that, this whole notion of what we see depends very much on what lens we see with. So this is why Swamiji says the seer is more important than what we see. You see? So if the seer is universal, what they see is also universal. If the seer is limited, then what is seen is also limited. If the seer's lens is fragmented or broken or cracked, what they see is also, limited. So we see this discovery that, Swamiji makes through this introspection. So, and this is the part that is very important, which is, these are the experiences, and the experiences, so I talked about the formless form, the experience, and the form, what our lives transforms into. And this is the part that Swamiji talks about. If you see a devotee, whatever deity that they pray to, or whatever gods that they pray to, a devotee, they have planted that seed of that deity, or they have planted the seed of that God, or they've planted that seed of, whether formed God or formless God. But what they see then is that reverberates, as I showed you earlier, in every facet of their lives. And all they see is that everything is a manifestation of that deity or of that God, you see. And we see that uh, the entire life is preoccupied with that formed version of God. And this is where, when the formless generates, that formless experience of God, that percolates in every facet of our life. So Swamiji talks about the evolution of the human mind. So a devotee often sees everything as a manifestation of that deity or God that they're praying to. He said, God willing, or, by God's grace, this is what happens. So everything, so we see that they are in that, state of mind. So again, that optional or the original universal thought is critical in determining our experiences and also the outcomes of our lives. So this is one stage that Swamiji talks about. The second one is actually, if you talk to a scientist, right, they have been trained to think in a rational way, in an objective way, in an empirical way, we're using experiments. So they see as atoms and molecules and energy. And so for them, that thought that everything that I'm experiencing is because of this nature that we have inbuilt with matter and energy. So everything is matter and energy. So that one thought that they think about existence is because I exist, because I have this biology. I exist, I can cognize because of this biology. And these are all because of the reverberation of the atoms and molecules. So they see the entire world as a combination of all the atoms and molecules, nothing else, right? So again, this is another state of mind that one has. The third aspect is, which is very interesting. This is philosophers, right? So things such as, you have people like, various great philosophers, like Jung and, what is many of the Eastern and also Western philosophers say that actually the entire existence is a state of our mind. All things, because, but existing in our mind, because our mind is what constructs, our mind generates thoughts, and our thoughts are our measure of experience. And that's, so our entire existence is how the mind, is able to create the thoughts, experiences, and that learning that takes place. And if it generates beautiful thoughts, the mind is happy, they see the world in a happy way. If the mind is sad or, constricted, they see the world differently. So he says that all things are seen but existing in the mind. It is the mind that generates all our experiences. So they provide examples where, you have one who is very positive, another one is very negative, and you give them a task, you see that the positive person will take challenges into, a learning experience, whereas the negative person will keep complaining. So he says that how we see the world depends very much on the state of our mind. See, so this is what a philosopher would say, right? The world is actually, what we experience in our mind. I think, so there is, because I think the world is that way. So this is another state of mind. But again, we see that, why is this important in the concept of Swamiji's? He says that, while, there's this formless, the focus is on the formless form, that experience, the thoughts, and that's what gives me that existence, how my world or my life is, I see as existing. But, and this is the part that is really, one who realizes this, he says that, what I'm seeking, everything starts with me. See, the epicenter of everything that I'm talking about, universal, God, existence, all these things starts with me, the self, you see. And there is a observer, there's an observer of the mind too. It's not the state of mind, you see. So, and I'll come back to the subtle difference between the mind and the self, right? So you see that if you see in the context of the mind, what does the mind do? The mind does thinking, right? So the mind does the thinking process is by the mind, and it analyzes, it creates thoughts and all those things, right? But there is an experiencer. There is one who actually is observing the mind, how the mind thinks, how the mind cognizes, right? How the mind, generates thoughts. And that experiencer is none other than that self itself. You see? So I'll take that in the discussion more intensively. Uh, and clearly, this self is what Swamiji is talking about. He says that when you realize this self, right, this is what we call self-realization. So, for example, when I think about, okay, I'm drinking something and, it's very tasty, and I'm, saying, why is it tasting this way? This is where the mind is thinking. This is what we call introspection, right? Why is this happening? How is this happening? And all those things. But when I clap my hands, the first thing you hear is the sound. So there is an experience that you've experienced. So there's an experiencer. Only then I say, oh, that was because of my hand clapping, the sound, and because of sound traveling. That's the thinking process. That's the mind now coming on. But prior to the mind taking on, there was an experiencer. The mind tries to rationalize what this experience is. That is slightly different. So there's a subtle difference between the self and the mind. You see? Now, for Mahans and others, you see that when there is, deep understanding, they see that even the mind becomes one with itself. But for an ordinary person, we see that, there is this thinking process. There's a lag. You experience it, and that is the experience of that self. And then you start thinking, hey, why did I experience this? What's the rationale behind this? This is where the mind is now starting to, try to rationalize this. So this is the self that Swamiji is talking about. He says that, when we realize, that both the seeing process and the seer is all from that self, that seeker itself, who essentially gives that experience, that experiencer. So he says one who experienced this then would be able to then understand that if you go back to the devotee, why the devotee is caught up by the deity, right? And how the mind is fixated on the deity. The same thing, one who self-realized would be able to understand why the philosopher is thinking in that way, right? And why a scientist is thinking that way. So we see that a self-realized person would be able to rationalize why each one of them are thinking in this way and what the ultimate experience is. So this is where and it comes from understanding that formless, dimensionless, which is universal, infinite potential substratum. So if you see very carefully, this formless, actually, when I first started, I started off with the formless. Actually, the entire space is formless. And that formless is imprinted in that, what we call, in the brain, in the mind, in our senses, everything. Everything is sitting on that substratum. Without that substratum, that experiencer or the self, the mind would not be able to generate thoughts and get that formless form experience and cognize that form. So we see that infinite formless is core to our own biology. Deep, although the biology has form, our brain has form, our senses all has got form, deep, within that, this hardware can only be operationalized if we have this formless embedded in there. So a computer would not work, or it's not of value if you don't have that software in there, or the spiritual ware in there, to be able to generate all the software. So I look at the hardware as the body. The software is all our experiences and things that we do. And the spiritual ware is actually our formless, infinite, state of existence, which all of us experience in deep sleep, in our deep tapas or turiya state, and also our original state of existence when we dissolve the body. So Swamiji goes on to say that just as the status of the grandfather remains latent in the grandson, that means the DNA, that cosmic intelligence of the grandfather, is embedded in the grandson, right? Similarly, a devotee in the course of worshipping of God, because they're worshipping something that they're searching for, which is already embedded in them. And that's why the search is there. But he says, when they become enlightened, they realize that what they're searching for is core to their DNA, divine nectar of awareness. But because they're not aware of it, they are in search of it. And the next part is really important. This infinite formless is latent in all of us. It is embedded in all of us. That means you don't see it, but it is there. You see, we see things. We ask, where is the seeing take place? It doesn't take place in the eyes. We say, well, the eye sees. No, the eyes just brings the spectrum. It says the brain sees. No, the brain just does the neural activity. The seeing takes place somewhere else. You know, it's latent in us. Only the self-realized that can transcend that form and formless form will realize that full formless. And this is where that introspection, contemplation, reflection gives you an understanding of the formless form, how your brain operates, how thoughts are generated. But if you push further to transcend that, that meditation and deep tapas is very important to quieten down the mind. When the mind is quiet, the mind is enraptured by the entire self. And that absorbed state is what that formless infinite state. And when one realizes that infinite potential state, when they come back and engage that material world, the mind becomes powerful because it now gets inspiration not from that external world, it gets its inspiration from that infinite self. It knows how to organize the thoughts. It knows how to select the thoughts that are really important. It knows how to inspire the thoughts. It knows how to generate that inspirational thought. It knows what is necessary for this material world to be inspirational, like the Paramahamsa. What is not important, it dissolves. And we see that, you know, this formless form, the experience becomes inspirational, universal, and you know, Magatana, you know, they say the Mahan like, you know, experience. And you see that that translates into form, into the actions, into things that translates into real life, you know, experiences that not only transforms one's life, but that of others. And this is what Mahan teaches us, that to touch that latent force in all of us, this Kundalini meditation is very important. And also that introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation as part of the I God philosophy is really important. With that, Sandosham. Thank you.